I see a couple new faces. Or just one actually. Boria seems new. Welcome, Boria. All right, how's everyone doing?
Fine. You?
Yeah, great. Busy.
Busy as always.
Yes, exactly.
You listen me?
What's that, Mohammed?
Hello?
Boy, we could hear you.
Okay. You listen my introduction or
Yeah, if you want, it will be interesting, but you don't
okay?
have to.
The microphone was not was configured. Sorry for my bad English. Okay.
No worries, it's
Uh,
fine.
I'm from Spain. I contribute one or two pull requests at the moment to Elsa, and I want to follow closely version 3 of Elsa. So I'm here to listen and see what's new.
That's great. Well, you're welcome on the meeting. Good that you could
Thank you.
join. So the way this works, at the start of the meeting, we come up with topics for discussion or little demos that we have prepared or just think of on the fly. And of course, if there's any questions or if you have a request to look into some topic that fits within this 1 hour of the meeting, that will be good to add to the agenda. So if you have anything in mind, please let me know. For the past week myself, I've been busy debugging, making the core engine and the designer more stable. As we've seen during the last community meeting, there were a couple of issues identified during the meeting, which was fun. And last week I demonstrated these topics here. So we talked about the flow HTTP request, improved JSON handling for HTTP workflows. By that, I mean, let's say you have an HTTP endpoint on your workflow, you receive some JSON payload. You want to be able to treat it as actual JSON. But of course, with Elsa and using Jint, which is a .NET interpreter for JavaScript syntax, you also have to deal with .NET types. So sometimes it could be confusing. And there were a few bugs as well. So those have been fixed. We also looked at improved parent-child communication, or being able to pass data into sub workflows and being able to communicate it back, which is something maybe we can reiterate because there were some issues when I did the demo. And since you're just joined for the first time, Boria, maybe it's interesting for you as well, since you mentioned an interest in Elsa 3. And during the session, if any questions come up or topics, please let me know.
Okay, I see the previous video of the last meetings. I update with the points.
Perfect. All right,
I
then we don't
follow
have to
the
reiterate.
meetings.
Gotcha. Well, that's great. All right, so if you guys think of something, let me know. If not, I'll just start looking at the commit history. Maybe something of interest comes to mind. Actually this meeting, I almost forgot about it, and I was in the middle of working on the following. Let me just talk a little bit about that, so you know what I'm up to. And it has to do with the inputs for these composite activities. And just to recap, a composite activity is, from the perspective of the designer, is just another workflow definition, but you can configure it to be usable as activity. And if this one is set to yes, it becomes available as a regular activity from the activity picker here. Of course, you want to be able to configure its input, its settings, like what we see here. So this is a custom field on the get sign of number activity here. And to configure that, you go to the input output tab. So here I'm just on a different workflow that uses this composite activity, but if we switch to the definition of the activity, I can show you the input and output properties. Just let me start the engine. All right, that started. Let me refresh. So here there's a workflow called get sign of number, and the idea is that this workflow will accept some input, some number, and it will return the sign of the number. So that's either positive or negative. So positive being 0 or greater, and negative anything below 0. And also as a test, it can also return two possible outcomes, positive or negative, which allows you to connect an activity to the positive outcome and to the negative outcome. And then depending on the actual value, the sign being positive or negative, the positive or the negative outcome will be executed. So this is just to showcase the set workflow output activity to set the output here. So it's an activity and you can configure it by selecting the available output. So this list is populated from whatever you have here. And here you can provide an expression to provide the value for the output. And this value then becomes available to the workflow using this activity. Yeah, so in any case, so we went over this during the last meeting. And while I'm implementing this for a customer, there's an issue with the input and the way it's implemented. So if you use it in a very simple way, like I'm doing here, actually, this is actually the culprit. Let me move this away for a second. So let's say use it like this. Then there's no problem. All of the activities can just access the input by using JavaScript in this format. So if you have an input called number, request a value using the function getNumber. So this is a naming convention where you can just prefix with get and then the name of the input, and it will return the value of the input.
Is that done by Jint, or is it implemented by you? That's the getNumber function.
Yeah, so Elsa declares the functions, declares the functions in Jint and also provides the implementation. So it's dynamic configured. So the Jint engine is configured dynamically with available functions. I can actually show you real quick. So this is how it works. So here we have a Jint engine. So this is a JavaScript interpreter. And here you can see we can just set values on it. So that works by setting a key and a value. And that if you put in a lambda or a delegate, I mean, this is what gets executed when you invoke this as a function. So it's very, very extensible.
Yeah, I debugged this week down to the Jint debugger because I need to understand the functionality behind it because I added dynamically inputs and output values and need to know when to get it at the literal or at the JavaScript way. And but it's a little bit different in Elsa 3 as in Elsa 2. But that's fine. Go on.
Yeah, for sure. There's a few differences. Yeah. So yeah, then you're familiar a little bit with the engine. Yeah, good. Yeah. So that's dynamically made available. The issue is whenever the workflow gets suspended and goes out of memory, then these inputs would be reevaluated. But if you go one level deeper, I don't quite fully understand, to be honest, the actual issue, but you basically don't have access anymore to the outer context. And so what would happen is whatever value is set to this input. So for example, going back to the consumer here, and let's say this is not a literal, but a actual expression, or in fact, this is an expression because it's set to JavaScript. This expression would be reevaluated right before the inputs are evaluated of the composite activity. And if there's too many levels, then it doesn't have all of the context. So that would then well basically break the inputs. It would not be able to find the requested input. So it's very buggy at this moment, and that's what I'm fixing. And the way to fix it is to simply copy the whatever input is provided. So as soon as this activity gets scheduled for execution, at that point, its inputs should be evaluated like with any other activity. So that's the same way it works with these non-composite activities. Those inputs get evaluated once and then they are available to the activity. The difference, of course, between a composite activity like getSignOfNumber is that it can potentially be long running. So it has its own, it is its own state machine. As compared to others like HTTP response, request, they are not long running. They just perform some functionality in C# and then they're done. So that's a very short-lived context, if you will. And this is long-lived. So that makes it a little bit complicated, but to fix that is just to evaluate the inputs right before this gets evaluated, as is with the other activities, and then store it in local variables local to this activity. And then those evaluated values are available as long as the instance of this activity lives. So that's currently my focus. It's an important fix when you actually use this feature with the sub workflows or composite activities. Yeah, you would otherwise run into troubles pretty quick. So it's important to fix. And another issue that I will work on right after is scoping. Right now, these variables that you see here, they are global in scope. And that's also the case if you go into a sub workflow like the get sign of number. All of its variables, if you were to declare a variable that has the same name as the variable in the parent workflow, one or the other would overwrite one or the other, depending on which one gets evaluated first, which obviously is a big problem, because now you have to make sure you don't use duplicate names, but you shouldn't have to worry about that. It should be just like in C# when you have different scopes. Nested scopes should be able to see variables from outer scopes, but not the other way around, and that's how it's going to work here as well.
Nice.
Yeah, so that level of isolation is gonna make it much better, and that also brings us much closer to being able to provide or do a proper stable release, even though it won't be feature complete with Elsa 2 as of yet, but at the very least it will be useful. And yeah, that's a good thing. I'm actually implementing a quite complicated workflow for a customer. Once that works, I can be sure that it will be useful for many other scenarios as well. So yeah.
You put it the HTTP request in the workflow. Could you do it again, please? And what are the dotted lines, the unmatched status code? What does it mean?
Thank you for asking me, because that's something I would like to demo. It's a new feature since last week, and let's create a new workflow. So there's two HTTP requests. There's HTTP request and there's flow HTTP request. So let's talk about this one first, and then I'll also explain this one. So forget about the word flow for a second. Just know that this is an HTTP request activity, and what it allows you to do is make a HTTP call to some endpoint. So let's say regress. Here, this is let's imagine this is our backend to get user information. So we'll copy just this URL here, paste it in here. So whenever you make an HTTP call, you can usually you will test for the status code, it being 200 OK, or maybe sometimes you also want to handle the 404 or maybe even 400 to test if invalid input was sent. So actually, let's test the latter. That's a better use, better example. Let's say we do post. So there's two versions of post, one that will return successful, which is 200, and one version will return 400 unsuccessful. And that happens whenever you forget to provide a password, for example. So let's say we want to make this API call. So we're gonna register. So we'll use this. It will be a post request. And then here we'll provide some JSON. So we'll say, actually, this is a returned now as a JavaScript object, which will be serialized into a string. You should be able to also just provide a string, JSON string directly, but I didn't test it and I'm afraid to try it right now. So let me just do it like this, because this has been tested. So let's say we want to send this payload. All right, so this will return 200, we know, but we're also going to be potentially receiving a 400 response, and that's where the expected status codes come in. So let me first tell you how you would deal with the potential response before we added this field. So if you forget about this for a second, the way to do it is you would look at the outputs, and then you would capture the HTTP response into a variable. Let's do that. It will be of type HTTP response. I'm putting this storage as memory because I know that the HTTP response is not serializable. In the future, we'll make this easier to automatically hint or even disable storage providers that aren't supported for given certain data types. But for now, you have to be very conscious what storage mechanism you choose based on the type that you're gonna store in a variable, because these variables are always going to be persisted, and the persistence provider depends on the storage driver selected here. Okay, so let me refresh that list. So now I'm going to capture the response, and based on this response, I can do a flow decision. And in this decision, I would say, let's say, if response that is code, I believe is the name. The IntelliSense is broken because of a small bug. I think if I refresh, it should work. So I think, yeah, status code. So if it's 200, then we know it's okay. So this is what you would do before this change that I'm about to show. And here, of course, you would say is 200, okay? Something like that. And then based on you could continue this way or this way. But this extra step is now unnecessary because you could do it easier with the expected status code. So here you could say, I'm expecting 200, but also 400, and maybe even 201 in case you want to distinguish between these two, and any number you like. Based on this input, you will get these additional ports on your activity. So instead of going through this flow decision, you can now directly connect the next activity. So that's a little bit easier to work with. So that's the idea here. Yeah, it's pretty good. It also has an element status code. So if you want to handle any unexpected code, you can do that as well, of course, like this.
It's possible to disable the default output of unexpected status codes?
No, it's well, not the way it's implemented now, but if you think that's a useful feature to have, then we can absolutely configure it. It's flexible enough to be able to implement that functionality. So we could have a checkbox somewhere that either enables or disables Ahmed's status code. That could be a good enhancement actually. But for now, it will always be there. But if again, if you think it's good to be able to hide this or not support it optionally, then maybe we should consider that.
Okay.
But if you do not connect anything to that port, to that output, nothing happens. So it doesn't matter if it's there or not.
It's to have a more clean designer or
Okay. Yeah.
viewer for the instance, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. To be clear, if this is not here and the response is none of these expected status codes, the activity will just end. But if there's no other additional activity to execute, the entire workflow will end, depending on if you have branches, of course. But in this specific example, this workflow would just end immediately. So it would not go to any of these, obviously, but just end.
Yes. That's okay.
All right, good. So now that we have seen this one, we can look at the other one. And that's HTTP request with the LMAT status code. And this, both activities, HTTP request and flow HTTP request, they inherit from the same base class. But the difference is, well, first of all, I don't see the setting anymore. Let me see if that's a browser cache issue. Yeah, okay, so that was some old script. So here you can enter the same thing. So the expected status codes, 400, 201. And as you can see here, instead of showing these ports here, it shows embedded ports, if you will. So these are embedded. And the difference is that what you can do with this activity, with this, this flavor, is you can handle 200 responses in its own little sub workflow. So here you could do whatever you want, maybe write something to the console. So what will happen now is that after this one executed, it received the response. It will execute, if the response status code is 200, it will execute this little flow workflow here. If it's 400, it will execute this one, etc. Or if none of these matched, then you can do something here. And what's nice about this approach is that you can do whatever you want before and then continue on like this. So these will be executed, or this one, once the entire HTTP request and its child activities finished. The main workflow continues on to this one.
Okay. If a sub workflow is called, is the original response, the body of the response, available within the sub workflow?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
okay.
exactly. So it works the same way. So you have this variable. These
Okay.
variables are accessible at any level. So
Okay.
yeah, exactly like this, for example.
Fine. Great.
It's similar to create a workflow and mark as usable as activity and use it for the outcomes.
Sorry, I didn't get the question. Can you repeat it?
Is this use is similar to create a workflow and mark it as
yeah,
usable as activity and
yeah,
use
this
it?
one here. It is actually. Yep. Yeah, it is. It's similar because when you create a sub workflow like this, so let me undo this thing here, and let's say
the question is in the in the inner it's create a workflow.
Sorry, here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
So
creating a workflow, no?
So it's not creating a workflow. It's actually what happens is that right now, this is like a property. It's a well, it's a port that stores an activity. So here you can store something that implements I activity. So what the designer does, it instantiates a flowchart activity. So this entire thing is a flowchart activity, and now here's another flowchart activity. And this is the designer for that flowchart activity. So in fact, you see it here, flowchart one. Oh, actually, that's the root. I think I hid it because it's implied. It didn't add any value. So this is the root flowchart. Then there's send HTTP request. This 200 contains this current flowchart activity, and this flowchart activity then has an activities collection, and that's currently has just one activity, which is this one. So it's not an actual workflow definition. It's just a composite activity, a flowchart. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so that's basically it. It's like a hybrid model. This is more of a sequential activity to use the terminology a little bit from Windows Workflow Foundation. Where they have a strict separation between flowcharts and sequence diagrams. And this designer attempts to be a hybrid because it's easier from the perspective of migrating from Elsa 2 to Elsa 3, where you still want support for flowcharts. But it's too soon to have a separate sequential diagram editor. I mean, it would be much more work and it would delay the release. So this is like a intermediate version of a flowchart editor. And the only disadvantage that I think at this moment is that it can be confusing to have two flavors from the picker. Like here you have HTTP request and flow HTTP request. The way I'm going to solve it is to allow the integrator or the developer to configure the available activities, and then it's up to the to those developers, the implementers, to decide whether they prefer these kind of activities or these kind of activities. At the very least, we have all of these options to choose from.
Two styles or of doing the same.
I'm sorry?
With this hybrid, we have two style or two option to doing the same in a workflow.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You have two options to do the same thing. And in both cases, you have HTTP request and flow HTTP request. Both do the same thing, but the way to model your process differs. So clearly here, after this 200 completes, there's no way to continue using this approach just from the 200 to, for example, write line, because write line is connected to this HTTP request, regardless of the outcome here, versus this, this one here, the same outcomes, but here you don't have these embedded ports, so you can directly connect the outcome to the next activity. So it's a matter of your particular use case what makes more sense, because what you can do with this one is have a done outcome like you have in Elsa 2, where you have activities like the if activity. It has a true branch, a false branch, and then a done branch. And even though it allows you to continue with the workflow after either the true or the false branch have executed, it's also a little bit confusing because it's not visually clear which one will execute first. And here you have at least the option to say, well, if 200 executes, then that's clear, or the other one, but there's no done outcome here. If you wanted something like that, you would use.
You can join the all of the outcomes on the upload HTTP request, and then you've got the same as the normal HTTP request. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah, you would do it like this. So then it doesn't matter which one executes. You could, of course, do stuff in between, like maybe this one you want to do it like this and then join this. And then you don't care about the others, you just want to continue. Yeah, that's the way to do it.
The loops are a nice example of this with the done branch.
Yeah, loop is in Elsa 2 is a good example. Here we don't have a flow loop, not yet at least. Maybe we'll add it, but for now there's only these looping constructs, and they only support embedded ports. And that fixes the issue where you could potentially go from the body in Elsa 2 to an arbitrary other activity. Here, that's just not possible. Everything that you have here will execute within the loop, within the iterations, and you won't be able to connect to, for example, this write line from this body.
What are the difference in the journal of these two options? How it looks?
Oh, sure. We can take a look at what that looks like. Do you want to look at a specific activity here that executes and then see what it looks like in the journal?
No, HTTP request, for
Sure.
example.
Yeah, okay.
Only to see the difference in the journal.
Sure. So let's do it like this. Let's say we have an HTTP request. We'll just have 200 to 400, and we'll use this URL. All right. So I copied this definition ID so I can invoke this using the REST API. So I hit send. Wait, that's not right. It should not have returned an instance. It should have returned with this one. Oh, wait, maybe this is post. Well, let's take a look at the workflow instances. So here we have an instance. It's finished. It's not currently showing the sub status because it could be finished, but errored. And right now you don't see that. That's majorly confusing. It should not display write line 3. I don't think we are. Oh, unless let's see. Zoom to fit. Oh, I see. Okay, so there's this a sneaky. So you see, this is if you have more than one starting activity, then the first one that was added will be executed for start as a starting node. And since there's no connection, nothing else will execute. So this is something to be aware of. But let's
maybe some kind of warning also should be implemented if there's more than one starting activity.
Exactly. Yeah, and or at least some helpful hint, because it is a valid case where you do want to allow your workflow to start with multiple ones, but it would be good to be aware of that in case you have it. Yeah. So let's try this again. Okay, so apparently we did a bad request because we got a 400 result. But in any case, first let's take a look at the journal. So this is the journal. Here we have a view of the workflow. Here we see what executed. So first we got flow send HTTP request, which is this one. Here we can see how we configured the activity at the time it executed. So imagine we were in some sort of loop, and during each iteration, the input of an activity changes. We would be able to see that on each entry in the journal. Right now we have a very simple workflow, so we only see simple data. Yeah, so it went from this request to HTTP response to which is this one. Of course, the interesting part will be figuring out why did it go to this route and not to this one.
So how could you do that? You could save the response within a variable and check what's the output of the variable, or how could you figure out why it is the 400 executed?
Yeah, good question. We should indeed inspect the response of the thing. So we didn't capture the response, but we can try. So let's go back to this one. And so this is the parsed object, but here's the HTTP response. Let's capture this one. So now that we have to capture this one, and let's say we come here, let's change this to get HTTP response. First, let me refresh, see if that IntelliSense bug is gone. So it has a body of type any. So I don't know what the type is here because any is not very helpful, but we can try, we'll see what happens. So now we got an instance ID finished with an error. So probably defaulted. Okay. Failed to convert an object of response message. Oh, system at HTTP. Oh, yeah, that's not going to work. Yeah, this is not an HTTP response message, of course, but let's do object. Okay, and then if this is a response message, I don't know if it has a body, to be honest. So it returns a bad request, which is expected, but I'm not seeing a reason. So this was the request message. Let's see what happens if we do it in Postman. This is okay. So I think at this point the only effective way to troubleshoot this one, because as you see the journal isn't too complete yet to be able to figure this out without proper debugging tools. So I would just dig into debugger and see what the response is from there, and also the request. This is like that. Maybe the content type should be determined from the content, but look, we can try setting it explicitly. Okay, so it didn't automatically include the content type, which I think is supposed to happen, but I'll look into that. But now it returned this information, so it went to the HTTP response one, which is this one.
The conversion from the JavaScript code to JSON is automatically done. So you entered JavaScript code and or the conversion. Could you maybe show it again?
This one.
The thing, yeah, you told before the content. So is it done implicit? Here the return, and then you entered the JSON code, and the serialization is done automatically.
Yeah, exactly. So indeed, so here it returns a JSON object, a JavaScript object, and
Okay.
in .NET it's modeled as an expando object, and the expando object is detected by this HTTP request activity. It sees an object. It's not a string, so let me serialize it. And when you serialize a expando object, it will be properly serialized into a JSON format. And there's a couple of types that it knows about, some of the common ones.
Great.
Do we have the JSON syntax and the content? Can we paste JSON directly in Elsa 3 editor?
Yeah, you should be able to. So just making sure, looking at the source code here. So this is the base class that handles the setting up the request. So here it creates an HTTP client. Here it prepares the request. Let's see, content try get. So here we get content of type object, so that it's could be, well, anything basically, but it's going to expect something based on what's determined by this HTTP content factory. So here we have an enumerable of HTTP content factories. So we have a bunch of them. So we have support for JSON, text, XML, and form URL. And this one will match JSON and text application, JSON and text JSON. And here it's going to do the test. If it's a string, it will just produce a string content, HTTP content object. Otherwise, it's going to create a JSON content using the object. So this object is going to be serialized here. To see if that works, what we can do is just copy this and switch to Liquid. Liquid will always return a string type. So here we can just enter the JSON as we would normally. So this is a JSON string. And if we publish this one and send, and then it also works. In Elsa 2, I think only strings are supported for HTTP request, or only objects, one of those two, I think. And
Can you
similarly,
set the content syntax to JSON directly?
come
Instead of
again?
Liquid? Instead of Liquid, can we set the syntax to JSON?
Oh, like here. Yeah,
Yeah.
not yet, but we will add support for that as well. So you can directly say, just enter JSON. At least we may add it because Liquid is like JSON. It doesn't really add much value, I think, other than maybe syntax highlighting, which is nice. But it would also be nice if you could have produce a dynamic value. So maybe Liquid is even more suitable because it allows you to do things like, you know, variables that some email, if you had a variable called some email. So it's more powerful this way.
Can you combine both to have the syntax highlighting of JSON, but with the Liquid variable?
Yeah, probably. It would be good, interesting to look at. And maybe if we were to add JSON here, maybe it should have support for Liquid syntax, just as a, you know, very opinionated configuration. And then you have the best of both worlds. And similarly, maybe so you would have JSON plus, or Liquid plus JSON, Liquid plus HTML if you are creating templates for send email, for example. That would be nice.
Yes.
Yeah, and it works the same way for content from HTTP response, and it uses the same mechanism to produce these content objects. So here too, you can provide a string or an object, which will then get serialized. And it will also take into account the content type. So maybe you don't want to produce JSON, maybe you want to produce XML or even an octet stream in case your object is a byte array, then you want to send it as a file download maybe. All right. One thing I noticed today was a response to on GitHub about the multi-tenancy topic. So I wanted to take a look at it briefly here. So here's the roadmap. Here's multi-tenancy. So it's an old issue. It's from 2021 by Craig. And Elsa 2 has support for multi-tenancy at the database level. So you have basically a tenant ID column that you can configure, and the API knows about tenant IDs that you can pass through the various APIs that are there. Elsa 3 doesn't have anything like it yet. The main reason is I want to really explore the options and come up with a good architecture. And I never got the opportunity to do it properly for Elsa 2, unfortunately. But thanks to the community, we have a lot of support for multi-tenancy in Elsa 2. But I also want to take this opportunity with this rewrite of Elsa into Elsa 3 to come up with a a decent implementation for multi-tenancy at the database level, so that you can use a single database with the same set of tables, so not having prefixed tables, for example, but actually being able to do it at the table level. And then somebody pointed out Finbuckle. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. I had not heard of it before, but it looks quite interesting.
Oh,
And
never heard it. What's Finbuckle?
so what I understand is that it allows you to implement multi-tenancy in your application. So it's a library that has a bunch of abstractions and concrete options for you to implement multi-tenancy.
Okay.
But I've yet to explore if it supports only Entity Framework Core, for example, or if it's designed in a way that it doesn't matter what persistence mechanism you use, that you can, maybe implement some abstraction and go from there. My only hesitance of using a library like this directly is the dependency on such a library. But maybe we can abstract it in a way so that it, if somebody doesn't like using this library for some reason, they could always, if they wanted to use multi-tenancy, they could implement a different strategy altogether. One way or another, if we want to implement multi-tenancy at the table level, the domain objects in Elsa will have to be aware of the of multi-tenancy.
The rebus for for multi-tenancy. Great.
Is that what it said?
No, but you could implement it like that.
Yeah.
But multi-tenancy is a big point for us because we're starting right with our project, and we need multi-tenancy for our project because we have a project where each of the customers could design their own workflows, and so it shouldn't be possible to see workflows from another customer. So at some point it should be implemented, but would be great if you could do that. But I know it's a big task for Elsa.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there's the good thing is
And on my side, sorry, it's okay, this is Dimitri. We also need multi-tenancy, so I just confirmed that it is an important task for us as well.
Well, that's great, because I was just about to say there's another customer that also mentioned it's very important for them for Elsa 3 to support multi-tenancy. So sounds like there's a good reason to really explore this in more detail.
Right now, it's the biggest missing feature for us. So BPMN would be fine too, but multi-tenancy is the biggest missing feature for us right now.
Even bigger than BPMN support.
Yeah, even bigger.
On our side, I would say basically controlling the data storage, that's most critical, because in some of our cases, we physically need to have a separate databases for different tenants.
Right. Yeah, and that should already be possible using, for example, Artifact, where you can set up tenant-aware service containers.
Could you show that? I haven't heard it before. What?
Yeah. So there's Artifact multi-tenants. So here they go explain what is multi-tenancy in their view, some general principles. And essentially, the way I understood it is that you will have a container per tenant. You will have probably a root container and then child containers where a container, like the difference have between singleton and scoped, you would also have another flavor of such a container, which is then tied to a tenant.
And you say we could use it already, this type of containers to store data for Elsa?
I think so, because and to be clear, I haven't tried it, so I could be wrong, but my understanding is yes, because you don't have to use the .NET's built-in iService collection default implementation. You could replace it with the Artifact implementation of that interface, and then also through that through this package, you can then take advantage of multi-tenant.
So if I
Multi-tenancy.
understand correctly, and again, this is just purely so it's checking. We can use Artifact, but rather than use default registration of services that provided right now as extension, we'll just register ourselves using this container tenant specific of Artifact.
Exactly.
Correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think that what the way it will, or at least one approach that it takes is that I've seen is that you configure your service collection, so the concrete object service collection, and then you construct a artifact container, and then basically feed it with your service collection and object, and then it will internally set up all of the dependencies, and from that point on, you'll produce an iService provider that is implemented by Artifact.
Okay, looks good.
Yeah, so here it talks about ASP.NET integration. Let's see, yeah, so here you can see you have your, this is a container builder. This is Artifact specific, I believe.
It's very I really like this approach again theoretically, of course, because even for distributed environment where we need to have acquired, so we need to have a lot of other services, being able to not reinvent the wheel, but to use on a level of iService container. That sounds very good to us.
Yeah, it's great because it allows you to separate configuration. So you can have a connector string per tenant, for example, but also have different implementations of services. So maybe one customer should use more fancy email service, let's say, and another one a more crappy one because they pay less. You could configure it at that level. So that's very flexible. But it will always require you to have separate connection strings, even though they could point to the same database. But then you need to make sure that you don't conflict between one tenant and another in the same database in terms of the tables being created, or maybe you can create a schema so that it's scoped per tenant per schema. So that's what it doesn't give you.
Okay, cool.
All right. So yeah. So ideally, I will be able to produce a reference application using Artifact, and I will probably start with that because it's very flexible and very suitable for most multi-tenant scenarios. And after that, look into Finbuckle, even if just to get some inspiration in terms of designing multi-tenancy at the database table level. So yeah, that's what I wanted to briefly mention.
Okay. Splitting the information to different databases will also be possible in the future, maybe. So maybe workflow definitions could be loaded from different databases.
That's possible today. So it's completely separated, and in fact, we have a implementation for workflow instance store to be stored in Lucene, or not Lucene, but Elasticsearch, so that you can have workflow definitions could come from your database, one database that you have, or even from blob storage or local disk storage, or from JSON files as embedded resources. And that storage mechanism is separate from the workflow instances. That could be completely different. And it's even optional. You don't have to store workflow instances if you don't even care about that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I can ask about the current status of the workflow context providers.
Yes. Let's see. So there is a module called workflow context. I started the implementation and had some success with it, but it's not fully tested out. So it could be lacking some features. So just to be aware of it, but there's something there. There's no documentation yet. I need to provide a proper, at least a proper sample application to showcase the usage. So it's there, but it's not finished yet.
Okay, thanks.
No worries. It's also been a while, so I can't say how far off it would be from completion. And what I can say, it is a little bit different from Elsa 2. in Elsa 2, what you would do there is configure your workflow definition with a context type. So that would be a .NET type name that you would provide there, fully assembly qualified. And then based on that type, it would find a associated workflow context provider that you implement yourself. And then it allows you to establish some ambient context, which is like a global variable to your workflow, but with information loaded automatically by your provider every time the workflow executes. And that's very convenient in case you work with certain domain entities that you need to make sure they are always loaded freshly from your own database, instead of having to load that entity or refresh the entity every step of the way in your workflow explicitly. This would be done automatically for you in the background. That's the way it works in Elsa 2. In Elsa 3, that will be the same, but it will have the option to provide multiple context. And also, it wouldn't be associated on the context type. Let's say you have a customer type or a document type. It would be associated directly to your provider. So you configure your workflow implementation with a set of workflow context providers that then they can then all provide the context or parts of the context to your workflow. So it's more flexible this way.
That's so nice.
Yeah, huh? I like that too. It was one of my peeve pets with with Elsa too. Let's see, just looking at the extensions here, save context. So this is what you would implement, an iWorkflow context provider. You have load and save. And I did have a sample at some point. I think I deleted it because it was completely, but yeah, thank you for reminding me.
It's similar to the configuration of the provider to Elsa 2, or
It's similar. The way it would work, maybe I can figure it out on the fly. Let's see, let's say we have a project called Hello World. No, not this one. So here's an actual workflow. Let's see. Oh, wait, sorry. This is just a static class. I'm looking for an actual implementation of workflow base. So that's iWorkflow. Let's see what workflow builder has. Actually, I'm looking at it from the wrong perspective because workflow context is an optional opt-in module. So the core doesn't know anything about context. It's an unobtrusive implementation of sorts. So I should look at it from this way. So let's see. We have workflow execution builder extensions. Okay, so that's pretty cool actually. Here we have a middleware that's being installed, not an ASP.NET Core middleware, but a workflow execution pipeline middleware component. And what that does, it allows you to, anytime a workflow is to be executed, it goes through a pipeline of steps. And by default, it will just be one or maybe two steps. The one being just responsible for running the workflow. But you can configure this pipeline to do stuff before the workflow executes and of course after it executed. And that's a feature is what workflow context takes advantage of. So it installs a middleware called workflow context workflow execution middleware. So it installs workflow context and it takes advantage of the workflow objects, custom properties, property bag, and it's going to try and see if it contains any workflow context. And if not, it just continues to the next middleware, which is probably just executing the workflow. Otherwise, it's gonna, for each workflow context, it's gonna invoke its provider, and the provider would be implemented by you, and it would be responsible for retrieving the data or constructing some context using whatever data makes sense in your scenario. But for each context, it's gonna get the provider, invoke your load async method, and then install it into the workflow context like this. So internally, that looks like, okay, so it's gonna set it into a transient property of your workflow execution context. So basically, this module provides extensions to conveniently and easily install workflow context and read your context back. But I will provide a proper example so that you can see which which methods to actually use.
Nice.
Context. Oh, and we even have I was just explained about workflow execution middleware. There's also an activity execution middleware, which looks like it's doing the same thing. So it's gonna just, for each workflow context, it's gonna be loaded and then be provided. But I need to remind myself why it's on both levels. It might seem a little bit extraneous to have two of them, but maybe there was a good reason. I need to try and remind myself. But I will come when I work on the example. All right, so that went by fast. Thank you for the questions. If you have any question before we leave, let me know.
Do you still planning to have 3.0 around April sometime?
Let's look at the calendar. So it's 16 March. So April at this point seems a little bit early given what's left, and that's what I mentioned at the start of the meeting, although that should be solved sometime next week at the latest. But let me remind myself quickly on the outstanding issues. I mean, it's possible, but its time goes a little bit faster than I expected. So here we have a little task overview. I want to finish the workflow context because that's people use it in Elsa too, so we do need it before the. Well, I want it to be there for the release candidate at least. This is a refactoring job that I need to do, and very important. I need a sufficient amount of documentation so people can actually try. Otherwise, the release candidate would be hard to use for people without guidance on the most common scenarios to use it for. So I think that's the bulk of the work. Honestly, I don't think beginning of April, but end of April is realistic. And if not, it should be May, but I don't expect it to be much later. Even more so because I know there's a few customers that are actively working on implementing Elsa 3, so they are reporting issues. We're fixing them very fast. So things are moving along very quickly these weeks. So it is possible, but we'll see.
I appreciate your transparency. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. And just to add to that, if you have anything that you're missing that you think is crucial to have as part of the RC release, please feel free to let me know, because that also helps drive priorities. Because as you can imagine, also looking at this list, there's a whole bunch of features and functionalities that are today in Elsa 2, but not yet in Elsa 3. And it's
I would say probably user task is the only one that kind of jumps into my eyes. Everything else we can wait for later.
yeah, makes sense. I wasn't sure if to put it in the release candidate or not, but maybe I will move this one back for ours. But thank you for that input. All right, well, great. Thank you guys for attending, and have a good one, and we'll see each other next week.
Thank you for the presentation.
My pleasure.
Thank you. It was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.